And I'm going to introduce you Pamila and her work. To begin with, I'd like to say that Pamila is a dear friend. We haven't met so often as I would like to, but when we are together, she's one of there's a special connection. I cannot explain why, as if we had been together working for years. But on the other hand, the people you have been talking to, they are also very dear people to me, and I have been working with them for years now. And I hope one day you can visit us at Universidade do Minho. Now, a bit of Pamila's CV for you. So she got her PhD at Columbia University in 2004, and now she is a professor at WISER, which is the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research at the University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg, South Africa. I wanted to say it in English and it came out African, which is strange. Sorry.
No. It's fine. Yeah.
Fine. Okay. So she has been doing research on Lusophone post-colonial links and legacies in India and Africa. And that's where we came across each other's work through Goa, in my case. And lately, I think Pamila has been focusing on Mozambique a lot, although she makes this triangle connection between Goa, South Africa, and Mozambique. One of her first books was from 2014, is a book on Goa, and it's called The Relic State, which is a very interesting title because it refers to Saint Francis Xavier. And you know that the Catholic heritage in Goa is something that I think both Catholics and Hindus, in a way, share nowadays, because I think Old Goa and the churches are a touristic place for Hindus as well, okay? And I suppose there's some sense of sacred there. So our first study, our first monograph in 2014 was this on this subject, and it's called Relic State. Then she has co-edited several thematic issues on feminist theory, on post-colonial studies, and critical arts. And I think this is very interesting because it connects with the three dimensions of our research group. So Pamila has also been working on feminism as well, and that's another affinity between our work, which I was not totally aware of. Then I would like to highlight the fact that she co-edited with Isabella F. Meyer and Michael Pearson in 2010 a book called Eyes Across Water. And this book really became a foundational publication, in the sense that it is after this book that many of us started to notice area studies, in the case of Indian Ocean studies. Before your book, Pamila, I have to say this, not to flatter you, but I think not many people were working or thinking about Indian Ocean studies. And after this book, I think it really emerged as a strong international field of studies. So I think Pamila is responsible for, in a way, launching Indian Ocean studies as a field of research. Now, more recently, I have picked another of her publications, a publication from 2019. So, and it is a book on Portuguese decolonization in the Indian Ocean world. And I asked Pamila to talk about this book to us today. And so, dear Pamila, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. All right. Okay, first it's an honor and pleasure to be with you here this afternoon. First, I'd like to thank Joanna, my dear friend, for inviting me to present as part of this very fascinating project. And I wanted you to tell me a little bit more about that beautiful image you had distributed with the WOMANART as part of your GAP research group at the Universidade do Minho here in Braga. Okay, so my reflections today, entitled Visual, Visceral, Lyrical, are taken from my recent book, Portuguese Decolonization in the Indian Ocean World, History and Ethnography, that was published by Bloomsbury Academic in 2019. And so I very much look forward to the discussions that will take place over the next hour. Okay, so I'm going to try and share my screen because I wanted to show you guys images. Sorry, let me open up the screen. Okay. Apologies, I should have done this before. Okay. All right, just to set the scene, you can see exactly as Joanna had mentioned, I'm sort of interested in connecting. I've been based in South Africa for 15 years now, and I'm interested in sort of connecting my earlier research on Goa into this Indian Ocean world that goes through sort of the southern Atlantic and Indian Ocean world of South Africa. Okay. Just to give the context, now I'm going to move on to the next. Oops. Okay, so I want to start with that one. Okay, this book was conceived in the moment that I first saw a particular image by Mozambican photographer Ricardo Rangel, the one that graces the cover of this book, and that is the image right here. His photograph accessed what I was trying to think and write about: decolonization as a way to connect India and Southern Africa historically and ethnographically. This book has been in the making over the past 10 years. Different essays were written over this time span and then put together as a monograph. I always had the idea that these essays were connecting what Aung San Suu Kyi calls slender threads across the Indian Ocean. I returned to Ricardo Rangel's photograph that made such an impression on me. It is the day of 19th December 1961, when people living in Lourenço Marques, present-day Maputo, read the public decree announcing that the quiet end of Portuguese colonialism in Goa after 450 years of rule. When people living read the decree announcing the quiet end after 450 years of rule. That Mozambique was also a Portuguese colony at the time the photograph was taken is not lost, neither on the viewer of the image nor the reader of the decree. So this particular photograph struck me as perfectly showing ideas of decolonization as developing trans-imperially, and that is something, a term I get from Laura Doyle, and how reading publics consistently compared their own situations to those elsewhere in the world, fashioning alternative futures for themselves in the process. What was going on then in the minds of this group of Mozambicans as they learned of Goa's demise and its incorporation into a burgeoning Indian nation state 14 years after its own independence from British colonial rule? How much did this moment make them think ahead, 14 years, to anticipate Mozambique's decolonization in 1975? It is the representational details suggested in Rangel's image that intrigued me, that opened up the possibility of thinking and writing about decolonization from a different vantage point. So my study of decolonization in this book is framed by 5 interconnected approaches. And what I want to do here is showcase individual chapters from the book as a way to illustrate these distinct approaches. So I'm not really going to go chronologically. I'm going to sort of make 5 thematic points and then use a chapter to illustrate that particular point, both through reading passages, ethnographic passages, and or showing some images. Okay. So my first sort of approach is to study the decolonization as simultaneously a historical event and an ethnographic moment, accessed through different eyewitness accounts, visual, oral, and written, or what I call here visual, visceral, and lyrical, hence my title, which I will discuss in more detail. What I was interested in is trying to track the experience of this transfer of state power. It is a way of trying to engage the state and state processes ethnographically, one that has a longer history in the discipline of anthropology. For some Goan Mozambicans caught up in these monumental changes, it was a double process of decolonization. First Goa in 1961, and then Mozambique in 1975. Here I understand decolonization less as a smooth political transition and rather one that was messy and complicated for those in power, those disavowed of it, and those caught between. I also argued that the manner replaces decolonization, that is, the very conditions of possibility, the very conditions of its possibility, shape the contours of its post-colonial landscape. In much the same way that Goa's forced integration into India in 1961, its cultural difference, that is, has always been a factor in its post-colonial condition. Okay, so what I thought I would do is just sort of read, selected some passages to read from the book, just to give you a sense of the textual and visual richness. Okay. Decolonization has often been viewed as an unproblematic given, an insignificant signifier in the transition from colony to post. As Achille Mbembe, my colleague here at Weiser, argues, it was a foundational moment that was not only based on an ideal of universal human emancipation, but it fundamentally reshaped peoples and states of the West, and I would argue in relation to and in the global South itself. I suggest that it is only in the more recent past, as we increasingly distance ourselves historically from certain decolonization events and moments, and with the understanding of decolonization as a globalized practice underwriting its own study, that it becomes a possible focus of research in its own right. I'm invested in looking closely at how decolonization is recorded, archived, historicized, theorized, and experienced as conditioning post-coloniality itself. I also want to make the case that post-colonial studies needs to take into account certain enduring affective qualities not often associated with decolonization. And then just briefly to go into this for a little bit on the decolonization itself. Historian Raymond Betts points out that the word decolonization entered the lexicon in the 1930s, but did not attain popularity until 30 years later. That is only when the concept had been actually put into practice. He emphasizes the difficulty of conceptualizing decolonization. And here I quote, "It is an awkward and inelegant word, therefore in a way appropriate to the subject it attempts to describe. Unlike the phrase end of empire, which has a certain poetic economy suggesting a grand and sweeping occurrence, decolonization is workaday, rather like other de-prefix words that denote cleansing changes." Furthermore, Betts rightly identifies that, quote, "decolonization was a clutch of fitful activities and events played out in conference rooms, acted out in protests, mounted in city streets, fought over in jungles and mountains. Its results pleased no one. It was too hastily done for some, too slowly carried out for others, too incomplete in effect for most. The subject is historically loose-ended. There is no end to discussion of it," end quote. So then writing about decolonization as a political materiality suggests that it was less than smooth and complicated, occurring in a wide variety of legal settings throughout the world, and at very different moments in time with very real consequences. It altered the livelihoods of all those involved, not only those directly in the service of the colonial state. That included the movement of peoples and things also reminds us of the workaday physical quality that Betts gestures to in the above quotes, and that I take up in a sustained manner in this book. In other words, circumstances change dramatically in both good and bad ways and overnight. We need to interrogate the universality of the event of decolonization in order to look at its particularities, the manner by which it happened as involving certain kinds of mobilities, as a moment of both closure and possibility, and as directly shaping the post-coloniality of a place. Okay, I'm going to end that first thematic approach there. Okay, so secondly, I'm interested in focusing on the materiality of decolonization. One involves the massive movement of people, ideas, and things across vast oceanic and territorial spaces in a heightened manner and rapid time frame. I bring in ethnographic details of infrastructure and experience to tell these stories, again, of the workaday quality of decolonization. Well, you must remember that for Goa, decolonization was unexpected and dramatic and took place over a period of a few weeks. And obviously, I'm not going to go into the details of that here, but whereas in comparison to Mozambique and Angola, it stretched over a 6-month time frame subsequent to one another. This is one of the most overlooked traits of decolonization, the sheer physicality of colonial demise and the amounts of stuff that got moved. The D of decolonization etymologically denoting a removal of sorts. Often this transfer of state power employed ships, caravans, cars, and planes, troops, and crates to get people and things out. For the case of Mozambique, some 450,000 white Portuguese were given 6 months to depart in 1975. In Angola, some 350 white Portuguese were granted the same ultimatum, but 6 months later, to depart their former colonial homes for the metropole, where they would be labeled retornados and treated as second-class citizens. And obviously that in itself is a whole burgeoning area of scholarship. Some 70,000 odd Portuguese soldiers, an incredible number in my mind, were also conscripted to help them get out. It is here that colonialism reveals how much it was in fact a history of possession, with decolonization showing its fallout, namely a painful process of deep dispossession, not only for those Portuguese formerly in power. Okay, so here I want to turn to a remarkable set of photographs taken by a Mozambican photographer, Ricardo Rangel, that he took during the last days of colonialism in Lourenço Marques in 1975, during the period of the mass exodus of the capital city's Portuguese population, to sort of illustrate this, the second thematic. Okay, and again, I'm going to read a passage from the book. Okay. I want to imagine Rangel staying up all night wandering the streets and back alleys of Lourenço Marques in 1975 in order to be able to take these photographs during unprecedented times and strict censors. It was the story of the independence of his nation that was unfolding in front of his camera lens, a story that needed to be told to his Mozambican counterparts and that I had been motivated to write about. His images remind me that colonialism is first and foremost an act of possession and its undoing one of dispossession. Visually, the set of photographs allows me a way of entering into and understanding a historical event, one of disintegration. Part of the durability of the set of images for me lies in the way they point to the underbelly of Portuguese colonialism in Mozambique. Rangel gestures to what was at stake. for those in power through a focus on details, people's personal possessions in the face of colonial withdrawal. It is a form of archival and ethnographic dialogue taking place between Rangel and me in and through his images. It's to those remarkable images that I now turn, images that Rangel showed to me personally when I visited him in Maputo in April 2008, and to which I could not remain indifferent, but have to attest to, just as Elbi Honwana did. And here I quote Honwana, a writer, a Mozambican writer. Initially, a motive for most of Rangel's photographs shown here is trivial. A well-known figure in the urban landscape, a gesture, an episode in the street, which everybody might walk past without even noticing. But after the treatment given to them by Rangel, they become powerful artistic achievements, human documents, and social statements to which nobody remains indifferent. Okay, and I'm just going to let this sort of images sit with you. And I go through a sort of longer reading of the images. And I'm just going to read a passage from this last one. The last image that Rangel shows me from his archive is a telling one, an empty street. An empty street, but with a lone person walking towards a viewer. Sorry, I just noticed a typo in my own book. Walking towards a viewer, a hand-painted graffiti label, Rua dos Desertos, the street of those who deserted us, on a wall below a fence, perhaps belonging to a house. Rangel's caption is significant, Fuga dos Colonos, the flight of the colonialists. This closing photo suggests the specter of decolonization as a process of emptying out of people, of things, of ideologies. It also shows both its utopic and dystopic elements that shape the everyday and make some people choose to leave for a particular destination, certain things in hand, and which will prove to be markers of a rich past and an unknown future. While others less fortunate with regard to class and race are not given the same choices in the aftermath of Portuguese colonialism's demise. It is a hint of the chaos bubbling underneath the facade of the seemingly orderly fashion of these moments of colonial departure that Rangel captures in his images that stays with me and no doubt with others. It is a subtle questioning of the smoothness of decolonization that the state wants to project that he so beautifully undermines with his attention to detail. It is both Rangel's politics in taking these photos that shows the complexity of colonial rule for those departing white elites who are experiencing it firsthand, and his choice of certain disquieting themes, soldiers, crates, and things, individuals' names, handwritten captions, the choice in lighting, etc. They capture what Elizabeth Edwards considers the expressive in photography. It is the visual and the visceral that together suggest a moment, here 2 weeks in length, much wider in depth and filled with both despair and hope, but with a sense that life continues, and more ideologically complex than we could have possibly imagined, having not witnessed it ourselves. Okay, so that was sort of an illustration of my sort of second thematic. Okay, so we're going to move on to my third. So my third area of research looks at the trauma of decolonization. Both singly and doubly experienced for many as something that has largely not been allowed to be articulated as a form of loss. And here again, I'm thinking about the retornados, but also the case of the Goans in Mozambique, especially for those ethnic minorities caught between matrices of new and old that I showcase in this book. Okay, so in my chapter 3 entitled Emigrating Goans, I conducted life histories with a range of Goan families who had emigrated to Lourenço Marques prior to 1961, and in order to live in a Portuguese-speaking Catholic world, and who stayed in Mozambique post-1975, both those who chose to stay and those who had little choice, living through its period of independence, socialism, civil war, and peace. Here I reflect on their class and race anxieties and marriage patterns in the face of Gilberto Freire's theories of lusotropicalismo, purported racial harmonies in the colonies, such that some Goans who married white Portuguese were treated as largely white colonials in Mozambique, while others who chose African partners chose to stay for fear of racism they would experience in Portugal. And again, I'm going to read a little bit from sort of my ethnography on this section of interviews with what you would call sort of Goan elites living in Maputo. Okay, this section is called Mozambican Independence, Chaos, and Dreams. It was chaos, but we had such dreams. That is the way Fernandes described the tumultuous events surrounding Mozambique's independence from Portuguese colonial rule in 1975. We were sitting in his apartment talking over a cup of coffee, his Portuguese Mozambican wife Maria by his side. They both described how it felt, as young Mozambicans barely 20 years old at the time, to get caught up in the politics of independence. They remembered feeling like they had a purpose, a reason for staying, although for Maria had been a more difficult choice to make, given that the rest of her family had chosen to emigrate to Portugal as a direct result of decolonization. For Fernandes, the decision to stay had been far easier, as the majority of his family had remained in Maputo after independence. In describing his positionality within Mozambican society, both today and in the past, he poignantly described how he continues to feel, quote, Portuguese without a concept of race, end quote. Perhaps Fernandes and Maria together in some sense represent a hopeful post-colonial Mozambique with all its complicated histories of migration. For other Goans living in Mozambique, the choice to stay or leave was one informed less by politics, but rather by age. As many of the Goans from the Society of the Absent, to use a term from Aung San Ho, including Fernandes, informed me, those who left consisted largely of elderly Goans, the majority of them leaving Lorenzo Marx to retire, and in some sense die in Portugal, a country and culture that for some was just as familiar as Mozambique had been, but for others less so. Interestingly, and this was a point confirmed by many of my informants, fewer Goans chose to return to their so-called homeland. Perhaps this makes sense given that some were even further displaced from it than Portugal. Delia was one of the many Goans who chose to stay in Mozambique in the aftermath of 75. She described the situation acutely, suggesting that those who left did so out of fear, whereas those who stayed, including herself, made the decision out of strength and commitment to deal with the unknown in the new Mozambique. Even as Delia perhaps oversimplified the decision to stay or go by eliding age, class, race, and gender politics, thus by removing these crucial factors from the decision-making process, the pride with which she made this declaration suggests the resoluteness of many Goans who committed themselves to life in post-colonial Mozambique. Interestingly, one of them, very same brothers whose path as a young woman she had followed by emigrating from Goa in the 50s, decided, not only for reasons having to do with seeking employment, but also being desirous of staying within a Lusophone colonial world, and emigrated from Mozambique to nearby Angola in early 1975, repeating once again the pattern of migration as a response to decolonization, even as this country would soon experience its own chaotic decolonization from Portuguese colonial rule. Other Goan Mozambicans, including Raul of earlier descriptions, explained that the divide who stayed and who had left had everything to do with race and class patterns of marriage. Simply put, if you were a Goan and married to a Portuguese, then you undoubtedly left. If you were a Goan married to an African Mozambican, you more than likely stayed. Raul made the statement based on his own life experiences, for he, a Mozambican-born Goan, and his wife, who was of mixed Portuguese, African, and Goan parentage, had actively decided to stay in Lorenzo Marx for these very same reasons. Here it is important to reinforce sociologist Boaventura de Sousa Santos' point that the operation of class politics and their racial configurations in post-colonial societies is a topic that needs more research. The same Fernandes of earlier discussions echoed Raul's point, suggesting that the decolonization created even more serious cleavages within families, again based on marriage patterns. More often than not, older generations would choose to emigrate, leaving behind the next generation of Goan Mozambicans. However, in some extreme cases, Goan parents would leave, cutting all ties with their host country and purposely not recognizing the impending marriages of their children to African Mozambicans. According to many of my informants, this cutting off of ties also happened among siblings. In other words, race was always a fraught generational category for Goans caught between Portuguese and African Mozambicans. Okay. Lastly, it's important to contextualize all these migrations within the context of Mozambique's political situation on the eve of decolonization. Here, I suggest that Goans occupied a floating position, to use Cristiana Bastos' words, caught between the outgoing Portuguese colonial administration and the incoming Mozambican government. On the one side, Goans were never forcibly told to leave by the Portuguese, but were given incentives to emigrate to Portugal, in much the same way that they'd earlier been motivated to move to Portuguese Africa in a bid to help out the colonial cause. Just as they felt embittered on the eve of Goa's decolonization, so too were they on the eve of Mozambique's. On the African side, the newly elected government claimed that Goans, like other minority groups, did not have a place in post-colonial Mozambique, stated that it saw each Goan immigration to Portugal as a confirmation of the betrayal of Mozambique and collusion as a group with the former Portuguese colonial government. In some sense, then, the Goans were used as pawns, even though they also had their own agency, in a larger game of chess, each side claiming them as their own, or at the very least as closely aligned with them, and with the details of each move eventually lost in the political struggles of decolonization and post-colonial transition. I'm going to leave that there. Okay. So that was my sort of third thematic. Fourthly, this project of decolonization is one of writing post-national narratives that takes its cue from the analytic work of this book. All the chapters reflect deeply intertwined histories, one that not only link Goa to Mozambique across the Indian Ocean, but also to Portugal and Southern African regional histories involving Mozambique, Angola, South Africa, and annexed Namibia. Decolonization becomes an entry port for bringing different governmentalities, colonial, national, apartheid, into one field analysis, particularly since it involved the circulation of people and things across territorial borders and oceanic waters. Decolonization then becomes the impetus for migration and diaspora making, a swirling world of mobilities in so many directions. Goa to Mozambique, Mozambique to Portugal, Mozambique to Goa, Mozambique to South Africa, Angola, and Angola to South Africa. Okay, so here I want to illustrate illustrate from a chapter that's called Driving from Angola to South Africa. In this chapter, I conducted a series of life histories with Portuguese Angolans living in Johannesburg, in contemporary Johannesburg. I looked at how they romanticized Portuguese colonialism as perhaps less racist, adopting Freire's concept, of lusotropicalismo, to varying degrees to justify their own experiences living in white apartheid South Africa. And that they discovered upon arrival as refugees that after they were put into camps in annexed Namibia, and the ways in which they were then educated to be what would be considered good whites by the South African Afrikaans, Protestant Afrikaans-speaking apartheid government in South Africa. Okay, so I'm going to read a little bit from that chapter. Okay, this section is called Exile or Saying Goodbye. Laide remembers the day that they decided to pack up their things and leave Angola. It was on a Sunday, 2 days after her cousin had disappeared without a trace, that her father decided it was no longer safe for the family to remain living on the coffee plantation he owned on the outskirts of the small town of Novas Boas in Angola's interior. He had brought his family to Angola from Portugal when Laide was only 3 years old in hopes of a better future for them all. Now, 11 years later, he determined that their future lay in South Africa. As Laide recounted, her father had been very optimistic about Angola's future at the time of independence. That was the reason why he waited almost 2 years up until 1977 to make the difficult decision to emigrate to South Africa. He changed his mind only when he felt that he had little choice given the dangerous political conditions of staying, what her father perceived and she described to me as the guerrilla tactics of post-colonial Angolan society. The new government's increasing hatred towards whites and the looming possibility of being embroiled in civil war. It is important to remember the larger historical context in which Laide's father made these comments. Historian Gerald Bender describes the migration from Angola in the following manner, quote, "This massive white exodus from Angola removed as many as 250,000 Portuguese from the country, the majority of them who had deeply ingrained racist predispositions and whose livelihoods had directly or indirectly depended on the exploitation of Africans," end quote. As a wealthy landholding elite Portuguese Angolan who followed politics closely, Laide's father had already prepared for such a possibility, having used his life savings to secure a property in Cape Town. That fateful Sunday morning, she, her younger brother, and her 2 sisters were told to each pack a suitcase. Laide's older brother was studying in Lisbon at the time, so the concern now was on getting the rest of the family out of Angola into the safety of South Africa. Since they owned property in Cape Town, her family was spared from having to stay in South African monitored refugee camps set up along the Namibian-Angolan border. Instead, they went for what she called a very long Sunday drive, arriving in Cape Town to start their Portuguese diasporic lives once again. Francisco's family was less fortunate than Laide's. They left Angola in 1975 under very different economic circumstances. At our meeting in October 2012, over a beer at a bustling cafe in the suburbs of Johannesburg, Francisco admitted to me that his very real fear of moving today is directly tied to the trauma he experienced as a young child leaving Angola. In an earlier interview conducted 6 months before, he had recounted to me his family's arduous and extended journey from Luanda, where he had been born, to South Africa when he was only 13 years old. He remembers how, as a young boy, leaving Angola had been a familiar topic of Luandan dinner party conversation. At the time, the choice of where to go boiled down to 3 places: Portugal, South Africa, or Canada. High-class Portuguese families were indeed flown out of Luanda, heading directly for Lisbon on the eve of decolonization. His family, however, did not have that kind of social standing, he remarked. His father, himself the son of Portuguese immigrants to Angola, had trained as a botanist and packed up most of the Land Rover with books and equipment that would enable him to continue his line of work, the profession upon which his family of 6 relied on for its survival. Francisco recounted the experience of living in Angola by sketching a map of southern Angola on a blank piece of paper hastily torn from my notebook, naming places such as Lobito, Benguela, Huambo, Lumbango, or Culakwe, where they journeyed, still largely unfamiliar to me at the time. He described the long convoy between 20 and 50 cars that made its way to the Namibian border. He remembers that their convoy was one of the last to be officially escorted of Angola by the Portuguese government. They made their way to Namibia, where they crossed the border with relative ease. Arriving in Windhoek, his father secured work as a botanist at the Namibian Plant Institute, and they lived there for the next 4 years, before finally settling in what was then the Eastern Transvaal of South Africa, now Mpumalanga. Duarte's story of leaving Angola post-75 echoes Francisco's, only is told from the perspective of a 42-year-old father. Together with his Portuguese immigrant wife and their 2 young daughters, he made the long drive from Luanda, crossing into Namibia, where they had to stay in various refugee camps before being allowed to proceed to South Africa. For her interview, I had driven around in an unfamiliar Johannesburg suburb for over an hour, having gotten lost several times despite Duarte's excellent telephone directions. Finally arrived at the retirement home where he resided. His townhouse was impeccably ordered with numerous family photos surrounding us as we spoke, including one of his recently deceased wife. Duarte was born in Angola in 1933 to Portuguese immigrant parents. His father had arrived there in the 1920s to work on the railroads, and his mother's family traced its roots to Portuguese Madeira, arriving in Angola in 1884. Since there had been little opportunity in Angola for higher education, Duarte had gone to Portugal at the age of 20 to pursue a degree in law. It was there that he met his future Portuguese wife, who returned to Luanda within 3 years later after he had earned his degree. Not wanting to work for the colonial government, he chose instead to work in the mining industry to support his then growing family. The decision to leave Angola had been an easy one for him for reasons of economics and politics. At the time, he considered it a temporary absence. His parents had chosen to return to Lisbon. After 60 years of living in Angola, his father was too tired, he explained, to start over again. He still remembers the day that Agostinho Neto, Angola's then first president of the newly established coalition government, made the statement that, quote, all the colonialists must go and leave the goodness for Angolans. Okay, I'm gonna end that there. Okay. So my fifth and last area of intervention is to open up the kinds of source materials we use to access narratives of decolonization as different forms of seeing, thinking, and writing about history. It is here that I juxtapose what I consider the visual, visceral, and lyrical. Theme sets of photographs taken by Mozambican photographer Ricardo Rangel feature in chapters 2, 4, 5, and 7 of the book, and work to provide a visual landscape of Portuguese decolonization as it took place in Mozambique. Following Rui Acebuju and Patricia Hayes, colleagues of mine here in South Africa at the University of the Western Cape, I ask what happens when we think about, quote, photographs as history, end quote. I rely on Rangel's incredible imagery and imaginary to suggest the contours of individual lives and subjectivities on the cusp of colonial independence. I also draw on ethnography for the manner in which allows me to access decolonization viscerally, that is, at the level of the individual, and to locate politics in the personal. Parallel to Rangel's photos and my own observations and interviews, I explore two sets of lyrical narratives for the rich details they provide of Portuguese decolonization in Mozambique and Angola. The first being Polish journalist Ryszard Kapuscinski, who provides searing descriptions of Luanda during its last days of colonialism in chapters 5 and 6. And novelists, I also include passages from novelist Miyakoto, who provides evocative passages on certain aspects of Mozambican society, and he features in chapters 3, 4, and 7. So I rely on images, ethnography, and text to carve out intimate stories of decolonization. Okay, so my illustration then is from my chapter 4 called Goins Going Fishing. Okay. And this is where it'll connect with some of my earlier research a little bit from my first book, The Relic State, and from Goa itself. So in June 2009, exactly 10 years after I'd gone to Goa to research San Francisco Xavier, I found myself going to Catembe, which is on the other side of the ferry, right from Lorenzo Marques, or present-day Maputo, in search of Sao Pedro. I had heard from various people living in Mozambique that there was a well-established but small Goan fishing community here. I was intrigued, particularly since I had previously done research on elite Goans living in Maputo, showcased in the chapter I read out loud a little bit from earlier. Many of them were first and second generation migrants, bankers and doctors by profession mostly. It was also when I saw the beautiful yet disquieting black and white photographs that the late Mozambican photographer Rangel had taken of this impoverished community during the early 1970s. Families living in bare-bone makeshift shacks built on stilts, the Maputo skyline a constant backdrop. This is perhaps what made me want to get a sense of this very different and go and diasporic experience in Mozambique, both in regard to generational shifts and by way of what is perhaps most intimate to them, fishing. In a manner parallel to the way that Rangel's photographs are infused with the social realities of these fishermen's literal lives towards the end of Portuguese colonialism, so too Mia Couto's deeply visceral descriptions of the figure of the Mozambican fisherman that open this chapter act as a way to enter into this distinct social worlding. And this is a series of 10 images that Rangel took in the early 70s of these fishermen. I also want to understand fishing as a rite of passage and its multiple affective registers. Neither do I mention Rangel or Couto merely in passing, nor for purely anecdotal reasons. Rather, my interest is in revisiting the theme of literature and photography, or text and images, as forms of post-colonial intervention in carving out oceanic geographies. And what I do is I continue to weave evocative images from both creators throughout my ethnographic sections in order to provide a more nuanced way to approach and understand fishing, not merely as an economic livelihood, but more importantly, as a way of being in the world for these Goan Mozambicans, generations of fishing folk, past and present, living on the edge of the Indian Ocean. It is a place that Isabel Hofmeyr reminds us is one of the oldest archives in the world, a place of, quote, deep history and multiple intersections, colonialism, imperialism, decolonization, third worldism, and the colonial Cold War, wherein both nostalgic dreams and failed utopias sit side by side. And this is one of my favorite images. Okay, so I just want to take another 5 minutes or so to finish up and conclude. Sorry, the sun's streaming in and it's getting brighter and brighter. Apologies for that. Okay. Okay, these visual, visceral, and lyrical source materials do not sit easily side by side. They rub up against each other in a way that suggests the larger point that decolonization was not smooth and always complicated, particularly when seen from the perspective of those caught up in and having little say in these larger colonial state processes. Here, I'm invested in exploring politics as a form of experience through the photographs of Rangel, my own ethnographic observations and description of Couto and Kapuscinski, in conversations with individuals caught up in the experience of decolonization, the thick description, of Couto and Kapuscinski, in rethinking the matrices for the Portuguese case of decolonization between Goa and Mozambique and Southern Africa more generally, I look closely at the implications of taking on a combined historical and ethnographic approach, one that I argue opens up a set of distinct research possibilities and understandings. In the end, I hope to have produced an archive not of empire, but rather of its end, that which is easily lost or forgotten in the transition period between empire and its post. Okay, so conclusion. As the book will showcase, I'm interested more generally in rethinking the condition of post-coloniality through the analytic of decolonization. Material processes of decolonization occurred in a wide variety of places throughout the world with very real and long-term consequences that are still felt today and that dramatically altered the livelihoods of those who had to make difficult life choices about where to live and die in some sense in an undefined future and in response to larger historical shifts that were not of their own choosing. The study of decolonization also holds within it much potential for rethinking the tensions of empire evoked so powerfully by Freddie Cooper and Ian Stoller 20 years ago, for exploring ethnographically the ties that continue to bind multiple metropoles and multiple colonies together in unsettling and unexpected ways, and suggest in some sense the ongoing reality that was the imperialism of decolonization in many ways, and that's from Lewis and Robinson. It is yet another form of entanglement in the way that my wiser colleague Sarah Nuttall describes for post-apartheid South Africa. While we cannot possibly know how these processes of reversing the slow violence of colonialism, a term taken from Rob Nixon's work, that take place during decolonization as they differ for each person and location. This book is an attempt to open up a way of understanding the effects of colonialism at the level of individual introspection, which in turn exposes a whole set of new registers and articulations. In more than one sense, then, my work is invested in understanding the devastating power of colonial affect for those persons caught in the throes of its material demise and its inchoateness. These are all themes that have been gently swept to the sidelines of the story of decolonization the world over. Mine is one small contribution. And then I just want to end with this. In the last chapter of my book, I showcase a found postcard by Ricardo Rangel of the city of Beira, an aerial viewpoint, most likely taken in the 1980s at the height of the Civil War. I visited Beira in 2009 and 2016 and took a layered look at four infrastructural sites of leisure: a swimming pool, a movie theater, a cafe, and a hotel, which were built in the 1950s and 60s for a white, largely Portuguese and Rhodesian population, a tourist dream city in the making that interestingly failed. And this is the subject of my last chapter of the book. It's called Renovating in Beira. My interest was to explore what happened to these colonial spaces left over and the creative processes of renovation that have occurred over a 7-year period by post-colonial individuals living in Beira. I wanted to ask how Mozambicans today live with decolonization, but without thinking it, something that South African literary scholar Njabula Mbele has written about, a point I pondered as I watched a young girl jumping into a swimming pool. Combining the visuality of the Rangel image with my own ethnographic ruminations at these four sites of leisure and lyrical passages by Miyokoto in the city of his birth, which is Beira, I wanted to gesture to a hopeful future, one that is filled with swimming pools, cafes, hotels, and movie theaters. And of course, I wrote this before the devastation of Cyclone Idai that hit Beira in March 2019, which of course perhaps makes my telling that much more poignant. Thank you. I'm gonna end there. Let me stop.
Thank you, Pamila. And I suppose that